Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of Tony T's Tune Talk, available at the Port Washington Public Library's YouTube channel. I'm your host, Tony Traguardo, and I'm ready to talk tunes. In most bands, the person in the back who is holding down the beat is limited to being just that, resident timekeeper. But in some instances, the drummer in the band is also fully capable of holding a melody, and sometimes he or she may even be the band's lead singer. With that in mind, let's take a look at a few of the best-known drummers who sing. He was 13 years old and recovering from a life-threatening bout of tuberculosis in the hospital when a nurse asked him if he would like to bang a drum in the hospital wing band. Such was the humble beginning of the astounding career of one Richard Starkey of Liverpool, England, someone who we would all come to know as Ringo Starr, after he joined up with those other fellows, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison. Richie's stepfather, Harry Graves, instilled his stepson with a deep love of big band music and their vocalists, introducing him to recordings by the likes of Dinah Shore, there she is, Sarah Vaughan, and Billy Daniels. Now, Richie suffered from a number of prolonged illnesses, and he spent a lot of time in the hospital during his childhood. This all prevented him from getting a solid education. So in his late teens, Richie had held down a few menial jobs, and he eventually acquired and then became dissatisfied with a position as an apprentice machinist. Well, comes 1957 and the release of Lonnie Donegan's song Rock Island Line, and with that the skiffle craze takes hold of Liverpool. And on Christmas Day of that year, Harry Graves gave Richie a second-hand drum kit. Now, although basic and crude, the kit that he'd been given facilitated his progress as a musician, and it also basically increased the commercial potential of any band that he would find himself in. So, at this important crossroad in his life, Richie considered focusing on his love of playing the drums as a potential way to better himself. Soon he was playing prestigious local gigs before the skiffle craze faded in early 1958 and American rock and roll started to become more popular in the UK. In November of 1959, Richard Starkey joined Al Caldwell's Texans, a skiffle group looking for someone with a proper drum kit so that they could make the transition from being one of Liverpool's best-known skiffle bands to being a full-fledged rock and roll band. Well, the band soon began playing local clubs as Rory Storm and the Hurricanes. Around this time, Richie adopted the stage name Ringo Starr, derived from all the rings he wore, and also because it implied a country and western influence. His drum solos would now be billed as Star Time. Now, the Hurricanes became so successful that when they were initially offered a highly coveted residency in Hamburg, Germany, they turned it down because of all their prior commitments in the UK. But they eventually accepted, joining this other Liverpool group over there called the Beatles at Bruno Koschmider's Kaiserkeller on October 1st, 1960, where Starr first met the band. Rory Storm's Hurricanes were, by the way, given top billing over the Beatles, who also received less pay. Ringo Starr quit Rory Storm and the Hurricanes temporarily in January of 1962 to briefly join the singer Tony Sheridan's group in Hamburg. The Beatles had actually been his backing band on a number of recordings. And on August 14th of 1962, following a brief return to the Hurricanes, Ringo Starr accepted John Lennon's invitation to join the Beatles. Now, by November of 1962, Ringo had been accepted by the Beatles fans, who were now calling on him to sing. During live performances, the Beatles would continue the Star Time routine that had been so popular among Ringo's fans. And when John Lennon would place a microphone in front of Starr's kit in preparation for that spotlight moment, the audiences would go wild. Once their recording career began in 1962, one of the Beatles' most distinctive characteristics when they appeared before the record-buying public was their lack of a true frontman. And while John Lennon and Paul McCartney certainly shouldered the majority of the writing and singing duties in the early years, the band's first LP set a democratic precedent of offering each member of the group his own vocal spot. It was a tradition that they would uphold on all but 3 of their future albums. Sir Paul McCartney has said of his friend and bandmate, "Ringo had a lot of fans, so we like to write something for him on each album." Ringo's first recorded appearance on vocals was on a raucous version of the Shirelles' 1960 single Boys, which was a showstopper of the early Beatles live sets. Ringo's love of country music also added variety into the Beatles albums, with the drummer taking lead vocals on rockabilly classics like Honey Don't and Matchbox by Carl Perkins, and sharing vocals with Paul on Buck Owens' Act Naturally, which Ringo performed live in front of 55,000 fans at Shea Stadium in 1965. The other 3 group members always encouraged Ringo to sing, but the drummer said that he was always insecure when he had to do vocals, so sometimes the others had to use little tricks to get Ringo to perform with the least amount of nerve attacks. The Beatles engineer Geoff Emerick recalled a time when the Beatles were recording a song written by John and Paul for Ringo. After working in the wee hours to capture a usable rhythm track for the song With a Little Help from My Friends, it was time to go home. The exhausted Ringo began to trudge up the stairs on his way out, but the remaining 3 Beatles had other plans. Paul proposed to Ringo that he quickly pop into the studio to do some vocals. Ringo looked to John and George for support, but both were on Paul's side. John said, "Oh, why don't you come back here and do some singing for us?" So, reluctantly, Ringo Starr took his place behind the vocal mic. And that was how he was able to sing and record the song With a Little Help from My Friends. With a little help from his friends. Emmerich said, perhaps the shock tactic of having him sing when he least expected it took the nervousness away. All 3 of his compatriots gathered around him, inches behind the microphone, silently conducting and cheering him on as he gamely tackled his vocal duties. It was a touching show of unity among the 4 Beatles. It is Ringo's clear-throated baritone that led a highly energized Beatles through their children's song Yellow Submarine, which reached #1 in the U.S. on a double A-sided single with Paul's Eleanor Rigby. And he also sings lead on the song that he wrote with the help of his friend George Harrison, the delightful Octopus's Garden. And Ringo's smooth tones actually dominate the Beatles group vocals in the semi-instrumentals Flying from Magical Mystery Tour, and on their career-closing The End, the final song on the group's last album, Abbey Road. At 79 as of this recording, Ringo is still unstoppable. Over the course of his 50-year solo career, he has recorded 20 studio albums, which have included 13 top 100 singles. 2 of those reached #3, and 2 reached the top spot on the Billboard charts. He also continues to lead his all-star band on regular live tours. Not bad for a drummer, eh? Ringo Starr has also been an inspiration to millions of young drummers all over the world. One young drummer developed her 3-octave vocal range in her college choir while studying the work of Ringo and her other inspiration, jazz drummer Joe Morello of the Dave Brubeck Quartet. Karen Carpenter started playing the drums in 1964. She was always enthusiastic about the instrument, and she taught herself how to play complicated drum lines with exotic time signatures. Is it any wonder then that her group's debut album, on which the young musician also plays bass on a number of tracks, features a stunning example of her drum work in 5/4 time called All I Can Do. Karen Carpenter's first band, 2 Plus 2, was an all-girl trio formed with her friends from Downey High School. They split up after she suggested that her brother, Richard, join the group. In 1965, Karen, Richard, and his college friend Wes Jacobs, a bassist and tuba player, formed the Richard Carpenter Trio. The band rehearsed daily, and they played many local jazz clubs. Richard was always impressed with his sister's musical talent, saying that she would speedily maneuver the sticks as if she'd been born in a drum factory. Now, Karen didn't sing in public as a soloist at this point, and if you can imagine it, the trio occasionally brought in another person to handle the vocals. Wow. In April of 1966, the Carpenters were invited to audition at a session with bassist Joe Osborne, well known for being part of the studio musician collective called the Wrecking Crew. Though she was initially expected to be just the drummer, Karen tried singing and impressed everyone there with her distinctive voice. With no real interest in Richard, Joe Osborne quickly signed her to a recording contract with his label Magic Lamp Records, which resulted in one unsuccessful single. By 1968, Karen and her brother had worked with a number of musicians and had even spent time with a group they formed called Spectrum. But as live performers, they had difficulty attracting a following since their sound was too dissimilar from all of the hard and psychedelic rock that had become popular in the clubs. When A&M Records finally signed the Carpenters to a recording contract in 1969, Karen started out as both the group's drummer and co-lead singer, singing all her vocals from behind the drum kit. She sang most of the songs on the group's first album, Offering, which was later to be retitled Ticket to Ride after their hit single remake of the Beatles song. Despite that hit single, though, the group's debut didn't sell particularly well. But A&M retained the Carpenters and decided that they should record a potential single next. In December of 1969, they met Burt Bacharach, and he invited them to open for him at a charity concert, which would include them performing a medley of Burt Bacharach, Hal David songs. For their next single, A&M label owner Herb Alpert agreed to let Richard Carpenter rework one of those songs, They Long to Be Close to You, as a standalone piece for the next Carpenters single. The duo struggled at an early recording attempt, so for the second session, Herb Alpert suggested that seasoned session player Hal Blaine of the Wrecking Crew play the drums instead of Karen, so that Karen could focus solely on her vocals. Karen was somewhat disappointed, but as a result of Richard's arrangement and her stunning vocal efforts, the Carpenters' version of Close to You was released as a single in March of 1970 and entered the charts at number 56. It reached number 1 on July 25th and stayed there for the next 4 weeks. Hal Blaine himself was actually knocked out by Karen's talent with the sticks. I always said that Karen was a good drummer, Blaine told Modern Drummer in 1983. I knew she could play right away when she sat down at my drums on sessions. She played on a lot of the album cuts, and she played when they performed live as well. So, despite her reputation as one of pop music's finest female vocalists, Karen Carpenter always considered herself to be a drummer who sang. And in numerous interviews, she would state that she never knew what to do with her hands when fronting the band, and she felt much more secure behind the drum kit where she belonged. Managers and bandmates, however, believed that concert audiences preferred to see a Karen Carpenter who sang as opposed to a Karen Carpenter who drummed. So sadly, it was never really her decision to truly abandon being the group's regular full-time drummer. But between 1971 and 1975, the Carpenters would headline 814 live concerts, and at some point in every show during that period, Karen would take her seat behind the drum kit to show her skills. And she also did play drums on many of the songs recorded for the first 6 of the 10 albums the duo released between 1969 and 1981. Aside from Hal Blaine, Karen's many admirers who have praised her are fellow drummers Cubby O'Brien, Liberty DeVito, Buddy Rich, and the folks at Modern Drummer magazine. Another young singing drummer was an extra during the closing concert segment of the Beatles film A Hard Day's Night. The young Philip David Charles Collins had been given a toy drum kit for Christmas in 1956 when he was just 5 years old. He also loved to sing, and he entered a talent contest that year where he sang the song Davy Crockett and stopped the orchestra halfway through to tell them that they were in the wrong key. Amazing. Phil Collins studied drum rudiments as a teenager, but he never learned to read and write conventional musical notation. Instead, he used a system that he had devised himself, something that he later regretted to a degree. But while studying the drums, Phil Collins was also pursuing an acting career. He actually played the Artful Dodger in the London West End production of Oliver just a few months before a fellow named Davy Jones, yes, that Davy Jones, took over the role. The Beatles, and particularly Ringo Starr, were a major influence on the young Collins. And he also followed the lesser-known London band The Action, whose drummer he would copy and whose work introduced him to the soul music of Motown and Stax Records. Collins was also heavily influenced by the jazz and big band drummer Buddy Rich, whose opinion on the importance of the hi-hat prompted Collins to focus on that aspect of his kit while playing. While attending Chiswick County School for Boys, Phil Collins formed his first band called The Real Thing, and later joined Freehold, with whom he wrote his first song, Lying, Crying, Dying. In the second half of the decade, Phil Collins continued to pursue acting roles as well, but shortly after losing the role of Romeo in Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet to Leonard Whiting, he decided that his heart really wasn't in acting. Music had taken over. As his musical career began to progress, he backed John Walker of the Walker Brothers on tour, and he released a very interesting album called Arc 2 with a band called Flaming Youth. In mid-1970, the Surrey-based rock group Genesis had decided to become a full-time band. And following the departure of their drummer John Mayhew, they advertised for a drummer who was sensitive to acoustic music. Collins decided he'd audition for that role. His audition actually took place at the home of the parents of the group's singer Peter Gabriel in Surrey. Collins arrived early, and he was invited to take a swim in the pool, where he memorized the pieces before his audition. Phil said his initial impression of Genesis was of a very soft and round music with vocal harmonies, and I came away thinking Crosby, Stills and Nash. Wow. Collins' audition was successful, and he joined Genesis in August of 1970. From 1970 to 1975, Phil Collins played drums and percussion and sang mostly backing vocals on Genesis's albums and in their live shows. His first album with the band, Nursery Crime, was recorded and released in 1971. The album's second track, For Absent Friends, an acoustic piece written by Phil Collins and Steve Hackett, is the first Genesis song to feature Collins on lead vocals. He also sang More Fool Me on their 1973 album, Selling England by the Pound. In August of 1975, following the tour to promote the band's album The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, singer and chief songwriter Peter Gabriel left Genesis. An advertisement for a replacement that was placed in Melody Maker magazine received around 400 replies. After a lengthy auditioning process, during which he sang backup vocals for all of the applicants, it was finally decided that Phil Collins would become the band's lead vocalist. The first track from Genesis's next album, A Trick of the Tail, marked Phil Collins' debut as Genesis's full-time lead singer. The album was a commercial and critical success, reaching number 3 in the UK charts and number 31 in the U.S. Rolling Stone magazine wrote that Genesis had managed to turn the possible catastrophe of Peter Gabriel's departure into their first broad-based American success. For the album's 1976 tour, Collins actually accepted an offer from former Yes and King Crimson drummer Bill Bruford to play the drums while Collins sang. With Phil Collins as the lead singer, Genesis would release 8 highly successful studio albums between 1976 and 1991. Those albums would yield 17 top 40 Billboard singles, including a run of 5 top 5 singles in a row between 1986 and 1987. And we can't leave out the small fact that Phil Collins also had his own successful career as a solo artist, and he released 8 studio albums between 1981 and 2010. His single releases, including his soundtrack work, have gotten him into Billboard's top 40 charts 21 times, including 7 occasions when he held that coveted #1 slot. Collins left Genesis in 1986, and the group released one more album, Calling All Stations, before disbanding. Phil has since suffered irreversible nerve damage that limits his ability to play the drums. But as of this recording in June of 2020, following his well-reviewed solo comeback tour, it has been announced that a Genesis reunion tour is in the works, which will feature Phil Collins, Tony Banks, Mike Rutherford, Daryl Stuermer, and Phil's son Nick Collins on the drums. Will other guests be invited to join? The plot will surely thicken. There are a number of other rock bands whose drummers have been known to carry a tune, but that's all the time we have to talk about them on this episode of Tony T's Tune Talk. Meanwhile, please remember that so much of the amazing music that has been discussed today can be found on the streaming services that are available through your local public library. Thanks for watching, and happy listening.